Welcome to the session, Intro to MarkLogic Data Hub Architecture, with Pete Avon as the speaker. I'm going to go through a couple of housekeeping tips real quick before I kick it over to Pete. But first thing is the mobile app. If you haven't downloaded it, please do. Also fill out the survey for this session. If you could, it'd be very helpful to us. The other thing is, please mute your phones right now so that Pete isn't disturbed. And then lastly, questions. We're going to hold questions to the end of the session. If we don't have time to answer all your questions, there's a lot of people in the room here, Pete will be available afterwards to answer your questions. He'll be outside here. And that's it. With that, over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Ed. Hello, everyone. Show of hands, how many people here are new to MarkLogic? Okay, excellent. How many people are using MarkLogic? Awesome. All right, well, cool. There's a lot to cover. There's a breadth of information. We might not go that deep on some topics, but there's other sessions throughout the week. But welcome to MarkLogic World. Pete Avon, Solution Engineer, MarkLogic. Been in MarkLogic going on 11 years. My first 5 were in engineering. My last 6 have been out in the field helping organizations understand and implement MarkLogic solutions. And so, the problem, we're going to start with the problem. The data's in silos. Silos aren't necessarily a bad thing. Silos exist for very good reasons. So stop silo shaming. You can tweet that, hashtag stop silo shaming. But the problem is when I have all these different independent information assets. So what are silos? It's an organization's information assets managed independently, usually centralized around a specific application. And there's 3 major problems with this. One is when I have my silo, my data quality, my semantics of that data, the trustworthiness of the data, the security of data is scoped to that particular silo. When I have many silos, I also can't enforce, it's really hard to audit, how is my policy and security policies for my business policies being enforced across those silos, right? A Forbes article from 2014, a survey came back that a single line of business in a large organization will have up to 65 different applications. When you hear application, think silo. And in MarkLogic, we work with people who literally, we help them integrate hundreds of sources and to create some sort of integrated 360-degree view. And the last thing is when people have a silo, they don't want to share information, right? Because if we can't ensure that our data is going to be the policies of our business, of our particular silo, are going to be respected outside of the silo, people aren't as apt to share that information, right? And we want to be able to create some sort of view across this data in a way that is secure and that is shareable, and that we can trust the quality of this data across the organization. And so organizations need a 360-degree view of something, whatever it is, right? We need to load this data into some sort of system, curate the data into some sort of shape that allows us to query across it in some rational way, and then deliver that data to downstream consumers. So there's an increasing volume, variety, velocity of data, as we know, and in this ever interconnected, interdependent world, the silo model is no longer working. And so we're going to go through sort of what this process looks like in action. And the things to think about above the silos of data are silos of people. So there's a change management aspect to this. When you start to integrate data, people are going to interact that haven't before. So there's sort of a mindset that you want to acquire for how do you successfully work with the hub, but then what are the principles that underlie the hub to enable you to integrate data successfully? And so the key principles of the hub, when we talk about the data hub, is going to be, essentially starts with data services first. So it's really about not, hey, what sources do we have? And starting with the data, we know we've got the silos. It's really about what business problem are we trying to solve? Let's start there. Like Steve Jobs has a famous quote, start with the user experience and work your way back to the technology. Too many people do it the other way around, right? Start with, hey, what's the business question we're trying to answer? Then we'll go figure out the data next. Expect and embrace change. Change is the only constant. Your sources in your organization are change. Your company's going to grow. It's going to buy new applications and buy whole other companies. You're going to get more data. That data is going to come in different formats, right? So this is about agility in the formats and agility in the shapes of the data, which the hub supports. But also people are going to want to access this data in different ways. Is anyone else hearing, like, I sound like I'm in a tin can to me? like I'm talking in a giant Coke can, if we can maybe adjust this or something. Thank you. So expect and embrace change. It's agility in the data formats, the shapes of the data. This is what the Hub supports, as well as agility in access. We have to go beyond just a single point of contact in a single query language. Different people are going to want to interact with this data through different lenses, through different languages and different connectors. Governed by default, when we get the data into the system, we want to secure it. We want to be able to apply our policy. And when we deliver that data to consumers, we want to know that, hey, it's been governed. It's trustworthy and our policies have been applied. Deploy anywhere. This is really about aligning our infrastructure to our SLAs. You heard Gary mention this morning, right? Write that application once, deploy anywhere. But we also want to be able to scale and contract and provide the systems where they both most make sense to support our consumers of our data. And so we're going to start with data services first. And so data services first, it's really like, hey, we start with what's that laser focus Justin mentioned during his keynote. What's the business problem we want to answer? What would a data service look like if I had an API where I could provide a series, if I provided these inputs and I got these outputs, what value would that add to the business? If I had a table that just had this data integrated for me that someone could go to with Power BI and be able to answer this question, that's the kind of data service I want to provide. Okay, great. We're going to define this data service. We're going to define a model that supports that service. We're going to ingest data, map the sources to the model, and then turn on the service. It's really a very simple process, and then we're going to iterate. Because what we start with is, start with the problem you want to answer today, and then incrementally and iteratively enhance the data that's in your hub, enhance your models, enhance your services. It's not about thinking, the traditional way is, let me go out there and monitor freaking let me do an exhaustive inventory of all my sources, get all their attributes, come up with the Uber model, and then write all the code that's going to feed the model, right? And we don't get to data in use till months or years down the road. It's like, hey, well, what are the things we can do now to get data in use and be answering questions, and then let's build off that without having to reload the data or reload our models. So, focus on ease and impact. When we go into an organization, this is a simple device for figuring where to start, essentially. You lay out 4 quadrants. Things at the top are the easiest things to execute. Things to the right have the biggest business impact. So when you go into organizations, don't try to think of every use case. Just usually you have a bunch at the top of your head, which are the things that are pressing the business today. And you list them out and you think about the resources available, the data available. And so in this one, what we're going to go walk through is sort of a customer call center scenario. MarkLogic has helped people do this, where a company has a product, they grow over time, they buy other companies, they have other products. Someone calls into the call center and they'll say, where's my order? And the call center rep could take up to 15 minutes looking at different screens, 15 minutes looking at up to 12 different screens. This was the scenario. Trying to answer this question, matching the customer that's on the phone with their order to tell them what's the status of that order. And this leads to customer frustration. They start losing customers. And when you have people on the phone that long, it can cost a company literally millions of dollars to support these call centers. So hey, but if we just got the customer and the order data together, if we had a simple data service where someone could say, where's my order, plug in some attributes for a customer, get that data out for their orders, we could get call centers down to 3 minutes. We'd increase customer satisfaction, improve customer retention, and save the company millions of dollars. So our find orders is where we're going to start. But we also know, hey, if we got that customer and order data, if we had a little product data in there, we could actually flag fraud too. So let's go for those two. So things in the bottom right, those are harder to execute, so you want to plan more for those. And the other, upper left are things you kind of do because it's low-hanging fruit, but bottom left, you try never to do those unless you absolutely have to. So what does it look like in the system? So we have a declarative way to define the where's my order data service. And simply say, hey, these are the inputs I want to the service, and these are the outputs. And then support of that service, we're going to come up with a model. So Ken was mentioning the enterprise entity, right? So these entities aren't like entities and relationships like you think of when you think of traditional data modeling. These are the key business concepts, the key mission concepts expressed as entities and relationships. You think of it as like creating a lens across these silos. What's the way we want to interact with this data? So for us, we have customers, and a customer places an order. So we have 2 entities, and we have a relationship between them. We're going to load the data. So after we have the model, then we can go out and look at, what are the sources for that? Oh, well, we have an ERP system over here that has customer data, a CRM system over here. We got order entry over here. Okay, grab us those extracts. Let's load it in the system. we map the sources to the model, and we turn on our service. And now, while these entities are in here, we can actually continue to enrich them with additional information. And so maybe we add information about policies, provenance, lineage. Essentially, these entities become, like Ken was mentioning this during his keynote, the entity is always changing, and we're always getting new information about these entities, and we're going to annotate them with additional information that's important to our business. Now, we complete the Where's My Order data service. We've loaded data, we've harmonized data just for the customers and orders, but we have this other flag fraud data service. It's basically repeat the process. Well, now, I'm going to define a flag fraud data service. And I say, hey, these are the inputs for my API, and these are the outputs I'd like to see. And we know we've got the customers and orders in there, but we're just going to, we can actually append, we can enrich and append to our existing model, and append and enrich the existing data with new sources. So we bring in the CRM data, and maybe it has some customer and orders and products that, well, it definitely has the products. But now we're able to have two services, and this is how it works. You add new services, you add a little more data, if you have to. We're actually only harmonizing what we need. We're only mastering and harmonizing what we need as we need it. So typically you bring in the source record and you have the original records, and because we work in these regulated environments where we're going to rationalize some fields and values, so we have some sort of canonical view, but we're going to have the original source so people can always come back and audit the source. But since you have the source, if you want to add and enrich more attributes or harmonize those later, you can. Finally, when you're doing this, it's about embracing and change is taking advantage of opportunities. And so the data scientists have been working hard on this taxonomy, and they've been working with products, but they know this product taxonomy works so much better if they had the customer and order info. And they see what we're doing in our data hub, and they're like, hey, can we load our taxonomy and leverage that with the products? Because we want to run this segregate cohorts algorithm. And so it's easy to load external sources of data and join that with the other data that's in the hub. And so they go off and they do some analysis, and they come back and say, hey, actually, if we hang these attributes off of customers and orders and products, we can add some weights so when people call in, we can make recommendations on upsells when people call in to do that Where's My Order with the call center rep. Right? So again, it's about leveraging these opportunities to integrate the data, to enrich the data for new services and new products. And so when we talk about data services, we've come a long way. It's like essentially we have a declarative way to define these data services. And MarkLogic comes with a breadth of API. We have a declarative way to define the entities and relationship model for these concepts, these business and mission concepts. But the services themselves, MarkLogic is a C++ runtime. It's a single binary, but we allow you to run data right next to the code. We believe in essentially that code locality right there with the data. And so you have the JavaScript and XQuery, or the programming languages, the scripting languages of MarkLogic, and you get to use those as stored procedures, and they run right alongside the data. This is very powerful because you can do powerful things with your data, but you let the database, it works in a shared nothing distributed architecture, and the cluster will determine how best to allocate the workload to essentially aggregate the results you're looking to put together. But again, we know that people are going to want to interact in other ways, so we do have a SQL interface. Sparkle is the language of graphs. We're going to get to this a little deeper, but MarkLogic's a multi-model database. It's a database for documents and graphs for triples. We express those with triples. Semantics is a whole other talk, but think of a triple as a node, edge, node, essentially. Anyway, and basically the point there was on the data services was on the programming languages available, and we have the declarative data services, but essentially we expose everything through REST out of the box. So expect and embrace change, right? So we're going to get new sources. I kind of mentioned that. The sources internally are going to change. We're going to get new sources. This isn't to be feared. And the more we load in the system, a lot of data that's coming from structured, we deal with a lot of structured data, but it's ripped and rendered and shredded. It's devoid of context, right? And so when you bring that information into the system, in the hub, you have additional context. It's easier for people to understand the data that they're working with and to derive new insights from that data. So upstream, we're going to have changes. Downstream, there's going to be new business requirements. That's not to be feared, because we're looking at these laser-focused services. We can provide new services, and we can do an experimentation, like sort of we did in the previous example with the data scientists. Let's see what that looks like. Can we get any other value out of leveraging this data in the hub? And then compliance and governance, this is about making sure we're applying policy to data throughout, and so I'm going to dig deeper on this. How do we do this? Well, so I mentioned the declarative way. We define a data service. It's going to generate essentially an API out of the box. We have other ways to, with the template engine, template-driven extraction, to derive a table, a tabular view across the data that we're integrating. But we define this entity, and what is an entity? Well, it's actually a document. And so the document is actually what we start with for when we say an entity. Entities are going to be documents. So when we go out to the source system, when you have a customer and it's shredded across 15 tables, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you know, an entity is like any, can mention any important thing to you, right? Any important business concept. But what's an identifiable object in the world? Like each of us is a unique individual, like person, right? So we're going to create whatever the attributes we're going to bring in from the source system, whatever that customer record looks like, and it's going to have the semantics of that source system. And because it's just a document, we can append to it, and we do. We add provenance, we add lineage, but we can add any additional metadata you want with regards to this document. And then we're going to put these documents into collections. Collections you can think of as a tag external to the document, but intrinsically linked. It allows us to create sets, and it becomes another way to manage these documents and slice and dice how we look at the information and manage it. But when we think about a document, documents represent data more naturally, right? So this speaks to that, you know, disconnect between business and IT that we heard about earlier this morning. I think it's because business has an idea of entities and relationships, their concepts, and then what happens is those entities and relationships get shredded and put into complex underlying storage systems, and they become disconnected from their data, right? But when you store information as documents, I could hand this document to anyone, or even an older non-technical relative, and they could read this, and in a few minutes figure out that this is a noise complaint for a police department. And I have some structure, I have context, I have clearly defined fields, I have data, I can read this and figure out what's going on. I have some strings, I have some numbers, I have some repeating elements. Everything's encapsulated, right, within the document. When humans have been communicating with documents since cuneiform, right? So it's like, what we do is we store things as documents as JSON or XML. And what happens is, we're not schema on write. A schema on write is, hey, let me define the schema, let me come up with a model, I create the schema, and now I've got to force all my data to pour into the schema. With us, we load as is. MarkLogic decouples data ingest from organization. So when you load JSON or XML, essentially what's going to happen is the structure and the text is going to be indexed automatically. That's how MarkLogic works. This is the secret sauce. And I can query the database and actually get those documents, and it's going to tell me on read what the schema is. The schema, the documents are self-describing. The schema is baked into the document. And every document can be unique, right? We have additional indexes for range indexes and geospatial. And of course, we've touched on collections. So back to our data service, we had one customer there with ERP. Now when it gets trickier, is I have 3 different flavors of customer here. My customer from my CRM system, a customer from an ERP system, a customer from an e-commerce system. And I could have my data service essentially do some magic to rationalize the values. I can actually query and start getting the information out of these out of the box. But we want to make it easy on ourselves to query across these, because what's going to happen is in one system it's first name, another one it's given name 1, another one it's FNM or something cryptic. Also, I might have some different date formats. One's a SQL date, one's an Oracle date. Doing date math, I want to rationalize some structure and some values, right? And so what we do, this is where the magic of MarkLogic comes in. Well, the first magic is, you know, I load it and it's indexed automatically. And so when I mentioned this data services approach of define the service, define the model, that's part of the service, and then load the data, these aren't serial operations. If you go listen to Alan Muller from Eaton or some of the other customers, they talk about, well, Alan Muller brought up this concept of data in use, right? Because these are actually tasks you do in parallel. You can actually load the information before you have the service in the model, and with the data loaded, you can actually be querying it, right? So this is where MarkLogic is able to get to essentially get people results in a quarter of the time of traditional data integrations, is because these tasks can run in parallel. But I've loaded my data, I've got my service, but what's going to happen in the middle here? Well, what we're going to do with this customer is we want to assert, part of that defining that model is, what are the properties we care about? Well, if it has and it has nothing to do with the semantics of the underlying storage system, it's like, what are the things I care about for a customer in my view of the world, in my integrated view? And so maybe I care about first name, last name, phone number, SSN, these social security number, date of birth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to assert that this thing has these properties. This entity has these properties. The way we do that is with a triple. Customer has first name, node edge node. Customer has last name. Customer has SSN. The model, the declarative model, generates these triples and these assertions for you. It's model driven. And what we do when Justin and we talk about like, hey, we're loading the data and it's going to be harmonized, essentially what we do is we map these sources to that model. He mentioned that mapping step during his overview. The mapping of the sources to the things we want to assert is a step. Once it's mapped, we essentially can harmonize that data. And what we're going to do is essentially materialize a new asset. Now here it's shown pictorially as separate, but it might actually be a header across all these because we're just working with documents. We're creating a way to essentially rationalize values and structure across these disparate assets. When you do this, essentially this is what creates that durable data asset, and that came from our customers. They call it the durable data asset because we have this transactional system. I've materialized this new entity. My business concept is an entity, but I have something now I can take action on. I can make decisions on, but I can communicate back with. I can annotate. I add metadata. Essentially, I have a new asset to transact on. But these triples go beyond just the assertions there. We actually use them to connect all the data in the system. And so I can use them for things like, hey, these source documents, what were they generated by? You know, that's a triple. Essentially, my harmonization artifacts, what were they derived from? Do I have different versions of these entities based on over time and whatever my requirements are there for maintaining revisions? I'll use that as a triple. And what these documents I've created, what is their type? Well, they're of type customer. But we can actually use them to assert, we can use these triples to assert PII, and that's what this is. So if someone has a social security number, we can add triples to, hey, what's the most important, what are these are the personally identifiable information elements that are in this document. And once I do that, I now have a way to query, show me all the properties, all the entities with a property that's PII. This works in two ways. One, for auditability, but two, if I've defined in my model something should be PII, when data hits the system, when I see that attribute, I can automatically assign some triple to it or assign some policy or some security to that particular element based on what I'm seeing on the incoming documents. And so these relationships are very powerful. So entities are documents, and relationships can get used in 3 different ways in MarkLogic, and they do. We have entities related to entities. So customer places an order. Order includes product. These relationships only exist in application code when you're in silos today. This isn't in any database. But these are the business understanding, the mission understanding of what these relationships are. You know, a customer returns an order. There could be multiple relationships between them as well. But when you have these relationships, one of the things semantics and MarkLogic allows you to do is I can infer new relationships off of existing relationships. So I can create a rule. If a customer places an order that includes a product, customer must have purchased the product. And these relationships become really important because they become a really great way. Well, one is, anyway, if you're doing I'll just bring up fraud as an example. There are times, or like abuse or waste, there's things where the presence of relationships or absence of relationships are indicators for fraud, right? And so when you have these types of relationships, they help you to do new types of queries, right, in the system, make it a lot easier to do that. But we have entities related to entities. Something else we do is entities related to facts, and that's what you saw with the entity model. This is that entity services-driven model where we're going to assert that, you know, hey, this entity has a social security number, and that social security number is type PII. We have a source document we have a harmonized document that was derived from a source document that's of type customer. And we can, these facts become little facts with regards to properties as well as to other related pieces of information about our entities. And then finally, facts related to facts. So SCOS is the simple knowledge ontology system, but a simple way to think about this is like a thesaurus. You know, so our person on the phone for our customer call center example, they want to know all the orders related to United Parcel Service. That's the freight distributor in the US, right? Well, what if in the system we have UPS, we have U.P.S, United Parcel Service, all these variations. We go into companies with lots of different codes. They'll have 400 different names for corn. We we worked at an agricultural company. People want to search corn, and just what will happen is we call it query expansion. Behind the scenes, we leverage these triples so all the variations of a particular term get expanded, so I get all the relevant documents for what the person is searching for. And so this is a sliver of what it looks like in the system. This isn't how we're going to interact with it, right? It's conceptually. In the system, it's actually just a whole bunch of indexes that we intersect when you ask questions. But we have this concept of, we have these source documents that are going to be materialized, these harmonized artifacts are going to be materialized, and then we're going to have triples joining everything throughout, and triples asserting what we want our lenses, what our entities and relationships for our integrated view to be. And so governed by default, this is about the sharing of that data. And the secret sauce here is really managing the policy along with the data, right? The way things are done today is the policies are sort of in subject matter experts' heads, or they're baked into application code. But what if we could create an artifact, a document, and put it in the system, and allow the developer, whoever's creating the data service, to just reference that policy and make sure it's enforced when people actually request the data, right? And so, how many people have had this discussion? Because I have. Am I doing on time? I'm doing okay. Essentially, this is, I was at Sun Microsystems when I started my career, and one of my first jobs was denied restricted party list. I was screening Sun orders coming into accounts receivable against a government service. They were very worried about selling Saddam Hussein a server. They'd been fined $2 million the year before for selling a server to someone they shouldn't have. So we were supposed to screen these orders against this service, and then if I found a flag, update global export management. And I had a domain expert explain to me what was the rules and the policy for the accounts receivable system I was extracting the information from, and a domain expert explained to me what are the rules of the global export management system, and I had to decipher what they were telling me in business speak into my fresh out of college developer speak, and I baked this into code. Everyone was very happy, but if they ever wanted to update that or change that, they'd have to dig through this code, right? And that's a lot of how these things are done. It's very brittle, and it's very, it's not agile. We want to stay agile. So if we had this domain expert work with the developer, and they maybe just define what their policy is as data, and we stored that data as a document in the system, it'd be very simple for the business user to go to a web form, or basically an Excel sheet even, update their rules, save it to the system, and all we have to do is make sure that that relationship exists between that policy and the entities we're creating, right? And then for the person requesting the data on the consumption side, hey, they only get to see the things that we know the policy's been applied to. And so secure by design. So from the ground up, from the start, MarkLogic's had security baked in. And there is like a whole topic. It's basically role-based authentication by default. When you load documents, they're loaded with security. We provide for element level security. An element, though, is not just a property that can be an entire subdocument. The secret sauce here is security is another index. And so when someone accesses information in MarkLogic, if they don't have the right security, the data doesn't exist to them. And that could be at the document level, or it could be at the subdocument level for properties. They see a view of the world that we want them to see based on the role they've been assigned, which is a role essentially assigns them to a set of permissions and capabilities. But we're doing a lot of work in the cloud, and because of that, we've supported SSL for a while, but we're like encrypting everything now. So there's encryption on the file system, but we have we're the only NoSQL database with a common criteria certification. In government, DITSCAP, PL3, we've been put through rigorous tests for the intelligence community to work in some highly secure environments. And so MarkLogic is very, very secure. Yeah, and that's a big part of governance and applying, that's probably the first thing that happens with all this is ensuring that people only see the data they're allowed to see based on what we want them to see. So finally, deploy anywhere. Oh wait, okay, I'm down my last 10 minutes. Where am I at? Who's my timer?
You got 20 minutes.
Oh yeah, but that's 10 for...
10 for...
Yeah, cool, thanks. We're doing better. I practiced this a few times, and I was always like, want me to quit at like 10 minutes till, and I just kept going over because I felt I had so much to say, but I'm able to streamline it now for some reason. Deploy anywhere. So we touched on this earlier. We'll get the QA. This is about aligning our infrastructure costs with our SLAs. It's really like, hey, I write this code once. Again, MarkLogic's a single binary, and so when we talk about deploying anywhere, on-prem, cloud, hybrid cloud, it's the same single binary, right? It's not like other products. There's different flavors and different versions depending on what you're running on. For us, it's the same system. Let me just move forward. But essentially, we can run on any cloud, and we componentize. Part of this is tiered storage, so I'll just touch on that because tiered storage is, we're going to store data in a database, and what's the disk look like? And usually, like this quarter's data, we care about. But as data gets older, it becomes less important to us, and we don't necessarily want to pay, for spinning disk if we could archive some of that data onto S3 or HDFS. And so MarkLogic allows you to manage the tiers of the database at the appropriate tier for which you want to pay for it. And the way we partition data, you can actually take indexed partitions of the database online and take them offline and put them on cheap storage, and then once a year, if you need to do your audit or whatever, bring them back online to ask the query you want to be able to ask. So you only have to, it's a way of managing the costs and only paying for the data that you need as you need it. But MarkLogic in any cloud, AWS, we're certified. Azure, we're super close to certification. Google Cloud, we're working on, and others. We're on K5 Fujitsu, we're on that Amazon government cloud. I just learned that one, this is the classified cloud. There's some other cloud. We have, the thing here that's interesting to me is we've been on the cloud longer than Amazon has with a database. So DynamoDB, our first customer was 2009, and I don't think DynamoDB came after that. So kind of wrap your heads around that one. We've had a database in Amazon longer than Amazon has. Now, how many people have deployed anything on Amazon or any of these clouds and gone through that fun, right? Because I did this like 5 years ago, and it's freaking nightmarish. It's a lot of complexity, right? It's gotten better, but MarkLogic, what I thought this morning was so awesome is the Data Hub service is we make it really, really easy, in 15 minutes to spin up a Data Hub service, and you don't have to manage all that complexity behind the scenes. And so what you're looking at here is really, this is the Data Hub service. And so the way MarkLogic works, when we talk about clusters, is 3 nodes make a cluster. And each node is going to have multiple partitions of the database. The system's going to look at it as a whole single database, right? But in a cluster, you can have E nodes, which are evaluators, and D nodes, which are data managers. And the idea is you break these up into tiers because an evaluator gets requests from the data service or from the consumer and says, hey, I'm looking for this data. The E node broadcasts that to the D nodes, aggregates the results, and returns them back to the caller. And they have different hardware profiles. If I'm an E node, I need more memory and less disk. But if I'm a D node, I need more data, more disk and less memory. And so this is the kind of thing you can set up if you run it on-prem, but in the service, we're just doing this for you. And we provide a series of endpoints, and we actually make it so the E nodes are scalable separately from the operational workloads or scalable separately from the analytical workloads. And so back to our call center scenario, right? Before the holidays, there's a whole bunch of, where's my order? Because, holidays are coming, and where's my mom's present? Is it going to be here on time? And that time, these operational ones we're scaling out those, right? After the holidays, the analytical ones, we're going to have more people. How are our sales this year, right? So more people are using Power BI or using the services, so we scale these out. As we're bringing in data, we're getting more orders up to the holidays. We're scaling out the curation. The data can scale too, right? And so, but this is elastic. You expand and contract. The intelligence is just in there based on your SLAs and what you want to provide. But we have people already doing this today in the cloud. It's elastic, so but it's awesome because basically we've taken care of all the operations and how MarkLogic clusters for you, so you can just plug into the service. And what you see above here is there's this ecosystem developing for MarkLogic now. So there are now, there's actually a low-code path through MarkLogic, which I'll get through. But you saw this morning, part of this morning, and now we have an app, the Pharma Research Hub, but it's much more than database as a service, right? So when you can get infrastructure as a service, and you've got to install the database. This is for any product, not just MarkLogic, and you got to manage that on your own. You can get database as a service. And the thing is with MarkLogic, I have a document database, a graph database, and I can do relational database stuff, but it's all composable. Everything in MarkLogic, a single binary, all these capabilities, we work very hard. Everything was developed with a Unix philosophy. Every service or every API does one thing and does it well, and it's composable with all others. So all the indexes, everything works together. But you would need multiple databases to do what MarkLogic's doing. You'd also need, essentially you'd need search. Search is our secret sauce, and that's baked in. It's a Google-style index applied to a document database. That's really the magic that happens. But security, as well as these tools for harmonization. So when Gary showed that slide this morning, we looked it up. It takes up to 14 different Amazon components to create a MarkLogic. Now, even use other products. When you have different databases, for us, it's all one consistent index and one consistent profile. So you're able to consistently and predictably measure how things are going to scale and how they're going to contract. If you do this with multiple products, you have to glue them together. And then the search index is going to require its own storage and capacity requirements. Each database, relational databases are different from graph databases, are different from document databases. And there's 3 sets of different indexes and storage capacity profiles I have to manage, right? And for us, we're storing and we're managing everything in a consistent way. But these are the types of things, when you start to think about putting together, rolling your own, right? There's a lot of complexity. But it's much more, right, out of the box now, because we provide the endpoints and the tools for harmonization and mastering of data. And now there's a tool chain. I mean, I'm really excited. It's never been easier. I mean, I've been MarkLogic again since, going on 11 years. It's never been easier to get data in and out of MarkLogic and to do things with data in MarkLogic. And so we have customers who are doing this. You heard about our MuleSoft partnership. MuleSoft and NiFi provide people ways to, through a graphical interface, connect to relational and other sources and slam information into MarkLogic. And with the Data Hub 5 and even Data Hub 4, we had our own UI we've started to add for the Data Hub, but for ingest, for mapping, for mastering. But there's other things. We actually have some other developer tools that are out there for entity services with using UML to entity services for people who want to use UML and have that translated to the model, or even Excel. And then on the consumption side, we have our connectors for Tableau and Power BI and Esri, as well as NiFi and MuleSoft. And so we worked with a customer this year where we got them, essentially from point A to point B, and did some very complex, powerful things for them, running very little code, right? It was all a bunch of configuration. 5 minutes, thank you, sir. And this is the combination of these tools with MarkLogic, the agility of MarkLogic database at the core. And I made it with 5 minutes. I'm gonna have extra time. I must have skipped over something. But again, I was trying to make it more succinct. But let me just wrap up by saying, I know this is a very high level. There's a lot here. Please ask me questions. But also, while you're here, there are, I would say, go to the customer sessions. Those are really powerful because you'll get to hear, hey, what does this really look like, technically and organizationally, and what were the benefits and what were maybe some of the friction we ran into. But talk to the experts, talk to me, talk to other MarkLogicians that are here, talk to other attendees, take advantage of your time here, and then when you get back home Monday, go out and build your first data service. And that's it. And so, yeah, questions?
Yes, I have two quick questions. Yeah. Can you talk about, say if you have a client, let's say you have a client that has a legacy system and the data, the systems say is like 3 or 4 generations old. I mean, they actually exist like that. Mm-hmm. What are the challenges transferring that data into this type of cloud system? That's A. And B, for departments like DoD, where you have multiple different systems where you have to interface to do a transfer of funds, it's very challenging because the two systems don't necessarily integrate. Can you discuss that?
Yeah. So the first part of that is getting the data into MarkLogic again is easy, right? So if it's XML or JSON, and most people have the truth is most organizations, there's a lot of flat files that are passed around, CSV or other. And so we actually have utilities to convert CSVs, and we actually have in our NiFi connector, or even MuleSoft, we can take things from relational systems and easily convert those into an XML or JSON document. When you denormalize, you can think of a row in a table becoming a document in MarkLogic. The collection would be maybe your table, right? It's a different lens. If you have mainframe, right, there's other things we've done because VSAM is sort of delimited text with an offset file, and we've developed a Java program that allows you to take those files and convert those into an XML document or JSON. And then there's actually an open source utility called Legstar from IBM that'll take COBOL documents, workbooks, and convert those to XML. So depending on what you're doing, the only thing it's tricky is binaries. Binaries are opaque, But even in MarkLogic, we have a filtering capability for PDFs and Office documents, where we'll take that and we can actually extract the text and put it into essentially the XML of a Word document or some sort of, we can create documents out of that. Things that are like OCR, you know, things that need optical character recognition, because people call it a PDF, but it's actually an image. It's just friggin' an image. You can't do anything with that. you need some other technology, and MarkLogic doesn't do that, but people have used Tesseract. But there's all sorts of ways. We don't have a problem getting the data in. The challenges can be organizational, but with regards to systems not interfacing with each other, well, there's no secret sauce, right? So it's like, hey, if I have this system and I have this system and I know there's some overlap, there's usually a subject matter expert, right? So there's a lot of people, tacit knowledge in people's heads. And so it's like, there's someone in the organization. We look at the code, we look at the systems, we're like, we don't see how the data relates. But there's this guy or gal, and you get them in a room, and they're going to tell you, like, oh, actually, we know if we look at these 7 attributes and this 5, and this is the case, we know it's the same thing. And so what we do is we talk to these people, and we get them in a room, but we take that knowledge and we make it a document. We essentially grab that knowledge and we put it in the hub. So the thing is, we just put it all in the hub, so we start to capture the institutional knowledge, and instead of it being on an ERD diagram or in someone's head, it's in the system, and then we apply that as a mapping, as a rule when data comes in. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Any others? Yes?
Less of a question, can we just go back a couple slides to the tool chain?
Yeah.
Taking notes on it and run out of time.
I was going fast. I go fast.
Yeah, this is the one. Thanks.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Does it load directly to the MarkLogic? Do you still use the load and harmonization scripts?
Well, yeah. So, anyone here familiar with the MuleSoft? I'm not familiar with MuleSoft. I'm familiar with NiFi, which I'm told is similar. But so the steps are the same, right? How you get there, the Data Hub framework, essentially behind the scenes, and there's a Data Hub session today. We're going to create something called a flow. There's actually an API for this. The Quick Start API that you look at, everything at MarkLogic starts with built-in APIs. And then we build higher level abstractions, and maybe a library to combine useful APIs together for some function. We expose these as REST, and then we actually have a Java API and a Node.js API on top of that. And now we're getting into apps, right? But in the Data Hub, there's that ingest, curate, access, right? And so on the ingest side, I can't speak to MuleSoft, but I can bring things into, essentially in the Data Hub, the way it works is we start with a staging database and a final database. There's going to be a database that's actually used for sort of the curation of our data, because that database has a different profile. When I'm banging on data and I'm manipulating it and I'm doing things with it, and I might have some complex steps than the final database, which is some more less touched assets, right, that are being more consumed, or how people interact is a different profile than the curation steps. But long answer to your question is, if I can get it in the system, I don't have to go through, essentially I can put it at the step where I want it to be, essentially from the external system. A lot of this is driven through collections or the APIs. So most likely MuleSoft's either going to slam it right into the staging database, and we're going to pick it up from there, or MuleSoft can pick it, can talk with the Flow API, and the Flow API can do some auto generation of the artifacts it needs, and then you bring the data in. That's just it's how it's going to work with the plumbing. Does that help?
Yeah, but when it comes to APIs, right, if it's like use data, APIs will not be able to handle it. Like, suppose we have millions of records.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with MuleSoft.
Even the APIs, like even MarkLogic has APIs, when you have use data, like it's not supporting.
Yeah, so, well, yeah, again, we get to things like, okay. Well, I didn't mention this. Okay, so when it comes to, besides REST, right, so MarkLogic Content Pumps our bulk import export utility for the file system, but there's an API for that. There's an API representation. It's the Data Movement SDK. And so the Data Movement SDK is actually the Java API that allows you to work with data in bulk, essentially, so that way you can batch jobs and multi-thread and do all that magic. I don't know how MuleSoft interacts with it, though, because I'm not familiar with MuleSoft. But come with me, up to me after, and I can introduce you to someone who can answer all your MuleSoft questions. Sorry about that. That's.
The
I can talk about the MarkLogic stuff, but the
The tools that you have referred, like connecting to Power BI.
Mhm.
So how do we connect?
Well, what actually happened is when you define those entities at the front, in that modeling step, customer order, behind the scenes, those assertions, those triples, we actually have something called template-driven extraction, and we actually create a tabular view of those entities you defined in that model. But you don't necessarily need that model. With these templates, it essentially allows us to overlay what would be the tabular view over some set of artifacts in MarkLogic. I want to call these elements columns, or these elements or properties columns, and these are their values. And they could be anywhere in the hierarchy of the document. The template gets created, essentially, we create a special flavor of that index. Now I've got a tabular view I can query with SQL, and then we have an ODBC connector. In Power BI, we're actually integrated directly. You can actually select MarkLogic as one of your options. You point to you give it the host and the port, the connection, and basically you're now querying MarkLogic. It's generating the SQL that's pulling that data in.
But again, TDS also have the same problem, performance. Like if you have a small data set, it works. But when you have millions of records, we have it.
Okay, I'm not familiar with your setup. There's a lot in that, right? So I'm not sure the capacity or what the profile of the data is, or the, I know we have customers doing it successfully, right? So but are you going to any expert one-on-ones? Okay. Have you talked to someone? Because schedule that so that way we can have. Oh, okay, great. Because if you do have those questions, that way we can get an expert who's more familiar or who can dig into these issues with you and help understand and resolve them. Yeah.
So Pete, you said you're going to create tabular models. The relationships are built when you do pull it into Power BI on the front end, or can that be built on the back end and use DAX and other things?
I'm sorry, but what's the?
So you said tabular model, right? Once you've got the data, you want to visualize, you want to put it
Yeah.
in Power BI. So the relationship still has to be built in Power BI between those different data sets.
Well, if you have different tables, yeah, you're gonna, yeah.
Interactive dashboards would require to have these.
Yes, yeah. So you'd have multiple views, right? But there's a sort of a default view that gets created as part of the process for the entity services. But you can create additional views. But then you're right. For more complex things, I'm going to be hitting different views or joining those different views in Tableau or Power BI. Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the delivery box under GUI?
The access box? Oh, faceted navigation apps, Grove. Okay, so everything with MarkLogic's APIs, and so essentially when you put the data in there, there's all sorts of REST APIs out of the box to get the data out. And Grove is, where do we get to Grove? But Grove is it's essentially an application framework that allows you to create a 3-tier application and stand it up with either Node.js as your middle tier or Java as your middle tier. But it's really function on a rapid way to create UIs on top of your data. And so if you go see the Farmer Research app, that's actually leveraging Grove. And so it's just because this is more for JavaScript and web developers.
So that's a third-party tool, Grove?
So no, Grove is an open source utility developed by MarkLogic that's out there and supported, and we use in places. Because there's things that a relational tool will answer. It's funny because we integrate the structured data, we create this view, and then people want it back in a structured view, right? And so we're doing our best there. But there's also going beyond that tabular view. And there's things with relationships and entities. If you look at the Farmer Research Hub, it's looking at publications, there's syntax highlighting, and then there's like, hey, I have a gene, and that gene has a relationship to a protein, and these have relationships to documents. But ways to visualize and traverse that aren't in necessarily a traditional BI tool, right? So the people want to go beyond what's in the traditional tools and leverage what's in MarkLogic. And so this is where Grove comes in. But it's just a quick way. It gives you some scaffolding so you can focus on the visualization. Otherwise, you can build your own using JavaScript and HTML. Yes, sir.
So I have two questions. Can we download these slides, or is there any way we can get these slides?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. We usually make the presentations available after, but I'll give you my card and I'll email them to you.
All right, great. And also, if you have environments that contain relational databases and maybe Bison or XML and maybe JSON and maybe even pictures, how do you get all those things into some kind of structured format or model?
Yeah, no, it's a good, so it comes back to here, it's that harmonization piece. And so in the system, you're right, the documents could be XML or JSON, right? But binaries, we actually have support for large binary support. Above a certain threshold, binaries aren't a database problem, they're a storage problem. But I want to be able to search those binaries. And so we provide filtering capabilities to extract metadata. Like, so images will have EXIF data embedded that tells you sort of like, it was shot with a Canon S3 on this date with this light or something, right? And we can actually take that and create a document. And so, like, Condé Nast uses us to manage all their images, the magazine, right? And what it is all these little pieces of metadata about the images. But the images are actually on some other storage. But we're going to create some sort of, some sort of entity name, right, for the thing we care about, a record. And we're going to have our harmonized or rationalized view. The thing is we're just loading the data, the XML, the JSON. Maybe I've got some, it's going to be XML or JSON for that binary info I've extracted. I can do searches across those, right? But I want to make it easier myself. If I want to do a rationalized view of that, I'm going to create some rationalized canonical view in XML or JSON that allows me to drill across these things. And that's part of the curation step. Does that answer the question?
But if you have a relational product also, in addition to those other products, how do you relate those relational to a JSON or a picture or a document?
Yeah, so that relational, so again, it's not necessarily about replacing the silos. The silos are still going to be there. And when I pull that information out of the relational, so I might pull the information out as is, but I'm not necessarily going to leave it as is. The first thing we're going to do with any relational thing is we're going to denormalize some relational records. We're going to denormalize to create the entities of interest. So if I have a customer in the relational, I might have a customer table, but it's it's linked to a phone table and an address table and a lookup table. I'm going to, for the information I call customer, I can either query that and provide those as documents to MarkLogic, or I can just take the extracts of those tables, load them in MarkLogic, and denormalize in MarkLogic to create the entity. Dimensional?
Yes, dimension.
So why don't you,
Yeah.
the session's over. If you have additional questions, you can.
Hey, thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending.